You could not live with your own failure. Where did that bring you? Back to me.
As many of you folks on the internet and fellow followers of mine would love for me to tear Snyder's filmography a new one, Lord knows how many times I've done it. Let me tell you all something right now. At a certain point, it becomes less a celebratory occasion and more of a reason to pay for a therapy session. It's bad enough that I had to endure his superhero reign of terror known as the DCEU, or what many of us know it as the Snyderverse. It's bad enough that I have to remind myself that he is capable of making good movies like 300 and Watchmen, mainly because he was given limited control and he wasn't writing anything. It's bad enough that his own original dream projects have disastrous results, whether they're in theaters or on Netflix. But the worst of all is that despite Hollywood having failed directors trying to make a resurgence in their career, learning from their mistakes, and aspiring ones that hope that their original idea will not only be praised by critics, but become a success financially, he is given numerous ample opportunities, optimal freedom, and millions of dollars from film companies with an ensemble cast to write and direct the same pretentious, meretricious crap for years on end, and doesn't even for an inkling of a second try to reflect on his mistakes and ponder to himself, man, some people have some issues with my storytelling. A lot of people have some complaints from my characters and world building. What could I possibly do? Well, rather than having the mind of an edgy teenager acting like I have something deep and important to say in my stories, maybe I should cut back on how stylish my costume design and slow motion are, how dark and gritty my directorial approach is, how nonsensical my plots are, and finally go out of my way to hire an experienced editor to fix some of my plot holes with me. Someone who can make my lore consistent and have characters iconic in their own right, not because they have a damn logo on their chest. But it seems he's unable to do so, and it shows yet again in the simply abominable Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire. Are you guys even shocked? It's cinematic slop that pigs with their 20,000 taste buds would reject with ease. And a lot like his films from the past and this decade, this movie epitomizes every single impulsive element and motif that he's been guilty of regurgitating since he first broke out as a filmmaker. To add insult to injury, this is yet another visionary concept from the mind of Snyder himself, quite a lot like Sucker Punch and Army of the Dead. An idea that could only be described as Dirty Dozen meets Star Wars, and it has been something that has been on his mind since 1997. In fact, in 2012, he actually pitched the idea to Lucasfilm as a mature take on the Star Wars canon. Eventually, the concept was picked up by Netflix, and while originally starting out as a limited series, has now become a two-part sci-fi space opera, one we are reviewing right now, and another coming out in April of this year. But man, just the thought of Snyder making a Star Wars movie. Ugh. For what we have here that Snyder thinks counts as a plot, the galaxy has been overruled for years by the conquest-hungry galactic empire known as the Mother World, led by a tyrannical senator named Belisarius after an assassination occurred to the royal family. With generic space Nazis ruling with an iron fist and promising to annihilate any rebel force that goes against them, everything begins to change once they arrive at the independent farming colony on the moon Veld. Once they've arrived and found out that the land is fertile, the formidable Admiral Atticus Noble threatens to decimate Veld, lest the colony replenishes his army's food supply with grain in 12 days. Unbeknownst to the intergalactic fascists, a former soldier from the Empire's military named Cora scours the galaxy along with her eventual love interest to look for leaders of former and present rebellions and other worthy warriors to help aid Veld in their defense against the Imperium, which will happen in part 2. Alright, let's touch on the less stressful part of this movie before my blood begins to boil again. Let's talk performances. Digimon Hansu, Michael Huisman, and Anthony Hopkins are all great actors, and Charlie Hunnam is perhaps the only person in this entire cast who even shows a shred of personality. However, Snyder's direction and script writing doesn't give him a whole lot to work with, and just reduces them into being dimensionless entities who tag along for the adventure because they do things that are convenient to the story. And poor Sofia Boutella is doing her best in this movie, and she's a solid actress given her experience in movies like Kingsman. But her ability to take charge as a leading lady is crushed by poor direction that only restricts her to being tense and emotionless constantly, and to deliver nauseating speeches quite like lightning from Final Fantasy XIII, to spell to the audience out loud who weren't paying attention in the movie her character traits, her desires, and her past, because Zack does not know how to write dialogue that doesn't involve exposition. Speaking of which, one of the biggest problems of this movie, out of many, happened right off the bat when you are introduced to the introduction. Now, if you're a filmmaker and you want to make a movie that is better than this one of the finest examples of bringing your audience into your world right at the beginning of the movie would be something like the beginning title screen crawl, like in Star Wars, where it establishes right off the gate who is good, who is bad, why they are fighting, etc., etc. Or even a narrated prologue, quite like Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, allowing us to understand the plight of the world of men, hobbits, dwarves, and elves, and the dark force that threatens their very existence. Rebel Moon tries the narration route and does an extremely clumsy job, because you are bombarded with a gigantic exposition dump vomited by a slumbering Anthony Hopkins about the succession of the evil senator eventually becoming regent, and the movie never attempts to explain or show to the audience what the hell they're even talking about. And you want to know why I have to bring up the clumsy narration at the beginning of the movie? The near entirety of this movie is exposition. Want to get to know the main and secondary characters authentically? Well, too bad, because half of their backstories are explained through dreadful dialogue and exposition that either doesn't make any sense, detail characters and events that happen on different planets that we never get to see or learn from, arrives at the last minute through a tedious scene in which Admiral Noble just explains through throwaway lines like an audio recording in a museum, such as their histories and motivations, one of which is a character that turns out to be a prince that was exiled and forced to become a slave, which is never mentioned again for the rest of the flick, or are introduced so lazily after a 2-minute sequence of the characters persuading them to join or to take part in an action scene or a task that they have to do that has all to do with the rest of the plot for the sake of spectacle and shallow world building. And sure, the world may appear expansive given the different cultures on different planets, and they've obviously been inspired by settings that Snyder has clearly a fondness for, like Vikings, gladiators, ninja assassins, robots, westerns, Native Americans, and yet he never takes advantage of them, nor does he even implement any level of substance or depth to them. It's all thrown onto the screen with tiny pieces of information that are either vague to understand or nonsensical, and the movie just expects for you to believe and accept that this is how it works, and you're just gonna have to deal with whatever Zack's got in his cranium. Relating to stuff that doesn't make any sense at all is that it is revealed in the movie that the Imperium troopers have K2SO-like androids that are used for manual labor. Why not use them to fight for the Imperium, you ask? Well, it's because one of the soldiers informs his commander that once the king was slain, the robots laid down their weapons and refused to fight in loyalty to the king. Then why doesn't this technologically advanced infantry and empire reprogram these droids to fight for them? You expect me to believe that this hyper-advanced empire that has conquered the galaxy didn't honestly think to themselves, man, you know what should really dismantle the rebels? We should take some of these androids that we use for manual labor and just reprogram them to help fight for us. We can use them as infantry, we can use them as kamikaze pilots, we can use them as suicide bombers. Nah, never mind, that's too easy. No wonder they're gonna lose in part 2. It's even stupider when you find out that the Imperium have a weapon on their dreadnought that could, in Halo terms, glass a planet. What makes you think that Velt has any chance of victory with their piddling resistance if a handful of dreadnoughts, let alone one, could raise a planet? I'm telling you guys, the minute that he is given a camera to shoot his sets with or pieces of paper to write his script drafts on, Zack Snyder is lost. He is like a kid in a candy store, a deer caught in the headlights. He has no clue how to get his characters to develop, nor does he have any idea on how to make his world building or his narrative that he created make any modicum of sense, or made clear for that matter. The entire story plays out like a boring fetch quest from a video game in which the characters had to get from point A to B to C to D. Except the movie is so aimless, poorly paced, and predictable that not only do you not care about any of these characters, but you have no interest in any of the stakes that are taking place in the story. The only thing he cares about more is how cool something looks before anything else. Case in point, the action scenes. It's the same song and dance as done before in 300, his cut of Justice League, and Sucker Punch, where the motif of going slow-mo to speed up to slow-mo is exhausted in nearly every single one of them. Hell, in some of these action scenes, there's slow motion within slow motion. The action scenes are so stilted and poorly choreographed, nobody knows what they're doing, and by the time an action scene is over, everyone just look like idiots. There was an action scene between one of the side characters and a giant spider humanoid that not only doesn't progress the plot, but the characters' strategies are so awkward and telegraphed that by the time the action scene is over, you think to yourself, did they think that that was a good action scene? The worst example out of all of them is when Cora is trying to save a girl named Sam from being raped by the cartoonishly evil stormtroopers. And the movie doesn't even try to hide how villainous the bad guys are. There is no ounce of subtlety in this. Rather than threaten to shoot Cora if she doesn't lower her axe, one moron holds his rifle like this, no, this is not a joke, and requests her axe in the other hand like this. And by the time she hands him the axe, you guessed it, she performs a trick and she steals the gun away from him and she kills the two soldiers who were threatening her. And for the rest of the fight, the troopers are charging at her at a single file line, refusing to use their guns, or whenever they do use their guns, have worse shots than the stormtroopers in Star Wars, and in close quarter fisticuffs get demolished by a girl who's not even as heavy as they are, because she, a lot like the other protagonists in this movie, have ridiculous plot armor. Oh yeah, and nearly all of that scene is shot in slow motion, by the way, just in case you didn't get it. I swear if you reduce the slow-mo shots in this movie, this film would have been like a solid 30 minutes long. You would also think that a movie that shares a $166 million budget along with its sequel would take advantage of its CGI. After all, we just had a movie this year called The Creator, which had a budget of $80 million with effects that rivaled District 9. But the visual effects of Rebel Moon are not up to snuff. Effects like the explosive aftermath of a laser blaster looking like a poorly rendered video game effect, vehicles flying through the cosmos in asteroid fields, lack any polish or appropriate frame rates, and the green screen compositing is phony as much as the backgrounds, which are about as jaw-dropping as a default Windows wallpaper. And what the heck is Zack Snyder's deal with how he chooses his shots? Ever since the release of the Snyder Cut of Justice League, he has added the element of having these blur shots in his movie that don't really emphasize anything other than the fact that, hey, they look cool. And with Zack Snyder being the director of photography for this movie, his shots are about as ugly as they were in the Snyder Cut. There are many instances where the movie has medium or wide shots in which you have characters that look pretty clear as day in the foreground, but within the background or with characters right next to them, in the same shot might I add, they are extremely blurry for no particular reason. You would even have shots that have radial blurs that serve no particular purpose other than the fact that, hey, it looks like an art house movie, as opposed to, you know, having any sort of meaning as to why the shot is filmed that way. But Luke, surely there's missing character development, sloppy world building, and a terrible story, but it will all make sense in part 2. Let me answer that question with another question. Why didn't it all make sense in part 1? Why didn't we get all the necessary information we needed to get involved in this universe and get to know these characters to where we get the sense that it is a completed film and not like 75% of the movie was taken out? Oh, of course. It's because Netflix and Snyder want to recreate the anticipation of the Snyder Cut by releasing an unfinished PG-13 version of the film where hardly anything makes sense, and releasing later on down the road a 3-hour-long rated R director's cut where the film feels like a quote-unquote completely different movie. This isn't a Kingdom of Heaven situation where Ridley Scott took 45 minutes out of the movie due to test screenings and film studios being nervous up until he releases a far better director's cut. They're doing this on purpose. Well, if you think that ordinary audiences will fall for it for a second go around, you've got another thing coming. To quote Judas Priest, "It's been so long since I've come back to my channel to review yet another Zack Snyder film, and now that I am here and back at it again, Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, is more than just a terrible movie. It's a disgusting, cynical disaster that tries to replicate the hype of a cut that wasn't worth releasing to begin with. An unfinished, apocalyptic waste of sci-fi celluloid that has hollow world building, bare-bones characters, and embarrassing spectacle, all because of the indulgence, impulses, and delusions of one of the worst storytellers of this generation." As of this video, Netflix will release the second part in April, and I guarantee you with my bottom dollar, it'll be just about as self-important and ostentatious as this. The honeymoon phase is over, Snyder fans. It's time to come to terms with the fact that your cinematic savior is nothing more than a false prophet. My name is Nukem, and you, my friends, have been blown away.